It's starting.
Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give everybody a few minutes to enter the room before we get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to let people file into the room for a few minutes before we get started today. Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Caroline Melly, and I'm the chair of the anthropology department here at Smith. I'd like to welcome everyone today to today's book conversation with Elliot Fratkin, Gwendolyn Carter Chair Emeritus in African Studies and Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Smith College. Elliot will be sharing excerpts from his recent novel, Maasai, a novel of love, war, and witchcraft in 19th century East Africa. I want to first give you a sense of today's structure of events for today. After a brief introduction, Elliot will read selected passages of his novel today. And then I will start the conversation off with a question before opening up the floor to all of you for your questions as well. Throughout today's presentation, we'll be accepting questions through the Q&A feature. You should see this button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then I'll select questions, which I will share with Elliot, and he will respond to us this afternoon. You're welcome to enter your questions into the Q&A at any point during today's event. So it is with great pleasure that I want to introduce you today to Elliot Fratkin, Gwendolyn Carter Chair Emeritus in African Studies and Professor Emeritus of Anthropology here at Smith College. Elliot received his bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania, his master's degree from the London School of Economics, and his doctorate from the Catholic University of America, all in cultural anthropology. His research has focused primarily on life and social change among nomadic pastoralist populations in East Africa. And over the span of a decades-long career, he has studied topics as diverse as social organization, cultural ecology, ritual life, economic development and change, humanitarianism, and health and nutrition. He has served as a consultant for the World Bank, as a US Fulbright Scholar, first at the University of Asmara in Eritrea in 2003, and then at Hawassa University in Ethiopia in 2011 to 2012. Elliot has also served as the chair of the Commission on Nomadic Peoples and as the co-editor of the African Studies Review, the flagship journal of the African Studies Association. During his time at Smith, Elliot served on the steering committee of Smith's Environmental Science and Policy Program, African Studies Program, and the Global South Development Program. And he was a faculty advisor for 5 college certificate in African Studies and the Culture, Health, and Science Program. He taught and advised thousands of students over the years, both here in the United States and in East Africa, and played a critical role in mentoring junior faculty like myself over the years. Elliot's publications have spanned many genres, from more traditional ethnographic monographs and journal articles to policy reports. In 2012, he embarked on a somewhat of a detour off the scholarly path with the publication of Laibon, an anthropologist's journey with Samburu diviners in Kenya. Laibon is a memoir of Elliot's fieldwork and decades-long friendship with a family of diviners in northern Kenya. Through the book, Elliot powerfully documents his own personal transformation and his coming of age through the fieldwork process. Maasai, a novel of love, war, and witchcraft in 19th century East Africa, is Elliot's most recent accomplishment, and it's the reason that we're all gathered here today. Maasai is a work of historical fiction, and it offers a glimpse into everyday life and social entanglements of a handful of members of a pastoralist group called Laikipia Maasai of Kenya's Great Rift Valley. The novel follows two lovers, Maron and Endelepin, as they confront the ups and downs of life, from their furtive romance and the birth of their child to warfare, smallpox, and the brutal arrival of colonialism. With this book, Elliot joins a cohort of other anthropologists who have experimented with fiction as a means to tell an important ethnographic story. Please join me in welcoming Professor Elliot Fratkin for a reading from this exciting new work. And please remember, you're welcome to enter your questions into the Q&A at any point during today's event. Elliot, the floor is all yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Caroline, and thank everybody who signed up for this, which actually at last count was 78 people. So I'm kind of astounded and very pleased. This was my retirement project after I retired in 2017 at Smith. It was a tremendous amount of fun to write. It's a work of fiction, but it's based on real circumstances, real events, including the Laikipia Wars of the 19th century, and also my own observations of village life and friendships and not so friendships during my fieldwork. Caroline covered, I think, most of the main plot, so I should probably just get into it and start reading. So the two heroes are named Endelepan and Maron. They are young people in the middle of the 19th century. They actually come from the same village, which means they cannot marry because they're in the same larger clan, but they are lovers. And in the process, we have Endelepan gets pregnant and has a child, Kituip. So the story will follow him through the events of the second half of this century, culminating really in this true, very large battle between Laikipia and Porco Maasai around Lake Naivasha in the 1870s. I'll start from chapter 1. And just ask questions and we'll get to them, I'm sure. Chapter 1, the Western Hills. Sudden shifts in weather could be dangerous. Rivers could flood, mud could make the journey slippery, morning fog could conceal raiders wanting to steal their animals. Maron raised his cattle stick and made a clicking sound. So the animals quickened their pace, their iron bells around their necks clanging noisily. He had been herding their village's 300 cattle with 10 other warriors from Lingwesi clan for 4 months. Dark rain clouds filled the sky over the hills to the west. The animals could smell it, the warriors could taste it. The change in weather touched their tongues with a taste of iron, and the steady breeze from the west announced that the rain was coming. They were heading home from the western mountains where grass was still found despite the very long drought. But these highlands were the territory of Pokot herders, enemies of the Laikipia, and Maron and his age mates worried about being attacked. They had walked about 20 miles this day, much of it up and down hills. While the cattle got to drink their fill of water, the warriors had to wait until the evening to drink their cattle's milk. Maron stayed on guard, scanning the horizon and the surrounding hills for danger. Let me see if I can get to the next slide. About an hour before sunset, the warriors stopped and made a temporary enclosure for the cattle from the bushes. As the cattle settled down, several of the warriors milked the few milk cows that they had brought along. There was not much milk, and they would need to add cattle blood to this, making it a meal that can feed them all. 4 men, Maron, Letuko, Artemis, and Teno, approached a large red ox to bleed. The steer had a round hump on his shoulders, characteristic of Boran cattle. Artemis held the ox by his short horns. Sorry, I keep losing my place. And Maron was ready with a small bow and arrow that would go right into the jugular vein, leading to blood coming into the container. After filling the bucket with about 2 liters of blood, Teno loosened the leather cord and the bleeding stopped almost immediately. The ox swayed a little, but he was no worse than where, and they let him return to the other cattle. Latuka brought the leather bowl of blood to the other warriors who were now resting under a large acacia. The warriors were all members of the same age set, whose age mates were collectively initiated by circumcision some 5 years previously. These men lived together, traveled together, made war together, and were friends for life. Some men added some more milk to the bucket of blood so there would be a sufficient quantity to feed everybody. Each warrior took a long draw from the vessel and passed it to the next warrior in the circle. The bucket made its way around until everyone was able to eat. The sun had gone down. They saw the sliver of the new moon, what they called the horn of the kudu antelope. The men fell asleep quickly, exhausted from their long day. But in the middle of the night, they were awakened by the sound of cattle bellowing in alarm. They heard the yells and the hoots from the Pokot raiders, whistling to move stolen cattle up the hill towards their home area. The Tuku, Maasai, Berengen moved fast, grabbing their long spears and running at full speed up an adjacent hill to cut the raiders off. Maron, Tenno, and several others chased after the Pokot and cattle directly, forcing the Pokot to stop and stand their ground. With their spears ready to throw, their spears ready to throw. From the left flank came Latuku and his age mates, attacking the raiders with spears, clubs, and swords. Maron and 6 others crouched and drew arrows into their powerful bows, wounding several raiders where they stood. The raid ended shortly after it started. The surviving raiders, about a half dozen, took off without any cattle. The Laikipiaq warriors stood over the 2 wounded Pokot. There was no wounded among the Maasai. Maasai and Berengen made short work of the survivors, pulling their heads back and slitting their throats with their swords. Maasai nearly cut the head of his victim off, causing a profuse amount of blood to spill on the ground. When the commotion had stopped, the 2 who had killed the Pokot laid down their spears and began singing the Marat song, the song marking the beginning of their present polluted state, which could only end with a ritual cleansing when they reached home. They sang, "The mother of my enemy has cried, my mother is happy. Let the crow eat, let the vulture eat. The hawk comes down fast, and if this is not true, then ask my friend. I can be heard from very far as I walk." While nothing brought greater honor than killing an enemy in battle, there was grave danger that the spirits of those killed would try to avenge themselves in their attackers, and the killers needed to seclude themselves. They would not drink blood again until they underwent a purification ritual. Maron was still shaking from the encounter. Unlike Latuku, he had never been in battle before, and his heart was still beating fast. Nevertheless, he stayed alert by the fire throughout the night, lest the raiders return. At sunrise, 2 warriors milked the cows and shared it with the others. They prepared to move quickly, the events of the previous evening still fresh in their minds and bodies. With loud whistles and flailing of their cattle sticks, the warriors moved the cattle down the hill into the broad valley, crossing the dry riverbed to push their cattle up the opposite hill until they could reach the pass that was closer to home. I'll stop there at that part. The Latuku is the best friend of Maron, but he's not a very nice person. He's brutal with his girlfriends, but he is the strongest warrior, and so they follow him. Now I'll go to chapter 2, Lingwesi clan. This one will concern Endelepen. Endelepen woke at first light. She wanted to stay reclined on the cowskin mat, but knew she had to get up. She could hear the village women singing their gentle songs as they bent over to milk their cows, pulling milk into the long, slender gourds. Inside her mother's house, Endelepen slowly pulled herself up from her sitting position and prepared for the day's chores. She wore only her sheepskin skirt, which was adorned with stone beads that matched her necklace. She had 2 iron bands around her upper arms, but she has not yet worn the iron earrings that signified marriage. She blew the embers from the dying hearth fire into life, adding a few sticks from the nearby woodpile. The fragrant smoke filled the roundhouse, escaping slowly through the sisal mat roof. She lifted her heavy clay pot and placed it firmly on the 3 rocks that were surrounding the cooking fire. Pouring water from a wooden bucket into the pot, and Endelapin tended the fire until the water boiled. She added some leaves from the secteti tree, making it a fragrant tea, and added some fresh cow's milk so she, her sister, and her mother could drink the infusion. As she poured the tea into a wooden cup, Endelapin's sister held and rocked her mother's latest baby, a sweet young girl named Tiggerai. Tiggerai means be still, who wiggled about so much. Endelapin remembered that today was the day she was to fetch water from the stream bed, an arduous task she regularly performed with her other girlfriends. They would collect water from the river into large empira drugs from 4 or 5 households. These were large clay vessels bounded by wooden sisal, and it kept the water cool all day. They will load 4 jugs per donkey and lead the line of 4 donkeys home. Her mother returned to the house with 3 gourds full of fresh milk. They acquired the long, hollow gourds from their Dorobo hunter-gatherer neighbors who lived in the forest. Endelapin mixed some tea into the clay pot to make the tea from the secteti, but she sweetened it with honey that they also acquired from the Dorobo. She and her mother chatted about how her marriage negotiations between Endelapin's uncle and the kinsman of her prospective husband, Wingy, were taking shape. Marriage talks were complicated matters, but ultimately the contract rested on how many cattle the groom's family would deliver to Endelapin's uncle. This was the bride price, and would ultimately be converted into a bride price for the men of her family, particularly her brother. One of the expected 8 cows, a steer, would be slaughtered for the wedding feast, which we held the day of Endelapin's wedding. So the wedding talks had begun several months ago when 2 elders from the Molian clan approached Endelapin's uncle and raised the possibility of marriage between Endelapin and their kinsman, Wingy. The groom-to-be was a junior elder who already had 1 wife and a young daughter. He was wealthy enough to afford a second wife who would produce more children to help manage his livestock herds. Endelapin tried not to think about the wedding negotiations. It was so confusing. It gave her a headache. The thought of being wed to a man 15 to 30 years older than she was too uncomfortable to imagine. But here she was, a young woman who had her first menstruation 2 years ago and was more than ready to bear children. Of course, Endelapin wanted to be married and have children of her own, as did every young Maasai woman. Who else would care for her when she was old, since she would almost certainly outlive her husband? But Endelapin was still a young girl, and like other young girls her age, she preferred to chat and giggle with her girlfriends rather than think about marriage. She longed for Maron to return, to feel his embrace, and to dance together with other warriors and their girlfriends and make armbands for her lover. Endelapin's thoughts were interrupted by her best friend, Sentin, who called from outside. Endelapin, let's go. We're packing up the donkeys now. Loading the packed donkeys was not difficult. They were docile creatures who allowed one to strap on wooden saddles to carry their heavy loads. Endelapin dragged the large but empty empira jug, which would hold the household's water. 4 donkeys were loaded, carrying 2 empira containers each. While the load was light, going to the wells, when they reached the riverbed and filled them with water, each jug would hold about 10 gallons, weighing about 80 pounds each. The sun was up for nearly an hour, and they knew it would get hot very soon. It was the end of the dry season before the spring rains began, the hottest time of year. It was a 3-hour walk to the wells below the hills of Larapen, where the riverbed was home to many hand-dug wells. They walked through the riverbed through a flat grassland, occasionally seeing a few giraffes as they got closer. They passed 2 other Laikipia villages as they walked, each belonging to a different sub-clan. These villages were large, about 20 houses, and protected by thorn bush fences to keep the animals inside. When it was dry, most of the cattle were being herded away by the warriors, returning only when there was enough rain to give them grazing nearby. And Delepin and her girlfriends walked steadily toward the wells that periodically they passed a large rock outcropping. This could be dangerous, hiding wild animals. They kept a lookout for lions and cheetahs and hyenas, who occasionally were seen stretched out on the rock. As they walked, and Delepin and Seton laughed and talked about their boyfriends in the village. And Delepin did not like Seton's boyfriend, Letuko. He was mean, and he would beat Seton up if she didn't give him sex. But Letuko also was famous for his bravery in war. When he was a very young warrior, he killed an enemy in battle, a Baran whose cattle they were raiding. His reputation as a killer was a magnet to girls like Seton, but he was generally avoided by most people in the village for being dangerous and unpredictably wild. For as long as Endelepin lived, and even before that, Laikipia had fought other pastoralist tribes for grazing lands. She knew from Maron and her other male relatives that the Laikipia had a reputation as ruthless warriors who attacked more often than defended, whose raiding parties could include hundreds of men, bringing back sometimes kidnapped girls and children. I'll stop there for chapter 2. Everybody okay? Can I keep reading? Okay. In the middle of the book, the warriors from this village, the Tuko, Maron, are going to war. They're going to raid another tribe called the Wasingishu Maasai, who live to the west beyond the Rift Valley. The next day, the warriors left for war. It was foggy and chilly at sunrise, only the soft sound of cattle stirring. The Tuko rose first, shaking out his goatskin cape. His age mate soon joined him. 50 warriors in all, not a bad contingent to join the other Laikipia for the war against the Wasingishu. Today and every day for the next 2 weeks, they would be running or walking fast to cover the 40 miles a day they needed to travel. They would journey down into the Rift Valley to Lake Nakuru before turning west to the Nandi Hills escarpment. They brought a few male cattle with them to feed themselves, but they also knew the cattle would slow them down. They would slaughter their tired cattle and pick up new ones as they went. The Tuku, their designated war leader, estimated they would gather several hundred more warriors as they went. They traveled across the plains until they finally started climbing a mountain called Marillo, a sweet-smelling forest of cedar and hemlocks as they climbed higher. While the main force of warriors continued up the plateau, others fanned out to recruit more warriors to their cause. The Tuko and Maron stayed with the main force, last until they came to the village of the Libon near Marillo Springs. Libons were medicine men who could predict the future through dreams or by throwing stones from their divination gourd or cow's horn. They could also provide powerful medicines to harm or heal, sorcery substances, as well as protective charms. The warriors often sought out the Libons for advice and protection. The Liban called Lesepin lived in a large village with 20 houses arranged in circles, containing many cattle. The Liban was rich and powerful. It was said his cattle numbered 1,000 head. He had 10 wives and many children. The warrior delegation, which included 4 men, 2 from the south and 2 from the north, included Letuko and the war leader, and Maron as the HZ spokesman. They were respectful as they approached the Liban's house, where the Liban was sitting outside on a cowhide, brushing away flies with his decorated fly whisk. He was a man in his 60s with a large black goatskin cape over his shoulders. His head was shaved, but he had a long gray mustache and wore a necklace with many amulets filled with his own medicines. He was tall and fat, the product of consuming so much milk, butter, and meat. Although many men would admire such wealth, Morone felt that the Liban's wealth was not acquired by hard work, at least not work involving cattle raising. Seria Napaya, Marine greeted the Liban. Serian, replied the Liban, where are you from? Morone said, we're from the east, near the Marile River. And how's the grazing there? Continued Lesepin in a normal and polite greeting. It was turning green from the rain, said Morone. Why have you come to me? The Liban asked finally, getting to the point. We're joining the Molo Lakipiak to fight the Wasangishu near the Cario River. We want your predictions and we want your blessings. Hey, said the Liban, I've heard of this fighting. Bring me my enkadang, he said to his young son sitting next to him, and bring me my medicine bag. The boy disappeared into the house and quickly returned with a large cattle horn and a light-colored goatskin bag. The Liban reached into his bag and brought out a soft sheepskin that was rolled close. Spreading out the sheepskin in front of him, he took the cow horn and removed the leather lid, sealing its wide opening. He spat air into the wide mouth of the horn, which was his enkidang, and said, this enkidang knows my truth and my legs and my lies, and you will tell us what is waiting for these spears, i.e. warriors, as they head into battle. Placing his hand over the wide opening of the base of the horn, the Liban lifted and shook it vigorously. He opened his hand from the mouth and shook out several polished white and black pebbles, which he studied as they laid down on the skin. He repeated this and cast out a dozen more pebbles. Then he gathered the stones. Tell me truths. I don't want to hear lies, the Liban said to the horn. Then he turned to Letuko and he said, I see you're a strong warrior. Did you not kill a pokat recently as you were herding your animals? Letuko and Morone looked up in surprise. It was not me, but my age mate, said Letuko. Then the Liban turned to Morone and said, I see you wishing for a woman, but you shall not have her because she's already married to someone else. These two warriors were astounded at the Liban's knowledge, but they didn't say anything. Morone hoped the Liban would not see or say anything about Endelepin's pregnancy, which only he and she knew about. So he goes on with his divination and he gives them advice and warnings. And he finally says to Letuko, he said, Letuko, don't wander far from the main group. Never be far from this Entasi medicine, which was another horn that he gave to Morone. I'll stop there. More time for questions, I always think is better. So I will stop and we'll take questions. Caroline, we'll read them as you send them to her. She might have a couple of her own.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Elliot. So my first question for you, actually, just to sort of kick things off right now, is perhaps you can talk to us a little bit more about your evolution and growth as a writer over the years. So what inspired you to write a novel? Where did it get you that writing a more traditional ethnographic account didn't? And how did your ethnographic training shape the novel as it was to become?
Great question. Thank you. You know, most academic writing is pretty dry. We all like to think it's not. We like to make it as interesting as possible. But it's not, in general, based on stories you hear. For many people, those are there. They're the interviews. But the idea of putting dialogue into an ethnographic study is not very large in most people's thinking. So my last book, which was the memoir of fieldwork, was all based on conversations that I had written down during my fieldwork from the 1970s and again from the 1980s. And I think it put a lot of meat on the bones of what I was trying to describe. The idea for a novel, I don't know where that came from. It's just I wanted to try something different. I had retired. I had an open page in front of me. I didn't particularly want to do more research. I didn't particularly want to do more reading of other people's research, which I've done for 40 years. I wanted to write a novel and I had ideas and I put down a structure and started to write. And I must say here, I'm very grateful to Smith College and some of the professors who organized writing groups, of which I was part of. So for over a year, every Tuesday or Thursday, I would go to a room with other people. We sit at the table with our computers and we would write. It was forbidden to talk to each other. I couldn't imagine another way to get 3 hours of writing done. So that got me through the year. And my many, many thanks to people who inspired me to do that. Once the novel was done, I knew I had a lot of great examples and I knew I had a lot of conversations. I had lived almost nonstop in this village, Lagoso, for 18 months, living as a son of one of the Libons, learning the language as best I could, participating with the warriors in their activities, talking to women, all kinds of conversations that were still in my head. So I started to package those as the story. And let me say one more thing. I said this before to a couple of people. Writing fiction is great. This guy Latuco, he was such a badass. He was such a nasty person that one day I woke up and I said, you know what? I'm going to kill him. And I did. That afternoon, I wrote him off and he was dead. Liebman's protection did not help him. And then I can move on to the next stories and the next stories. And always in the context of the real events that took place, the drought, the big fight, the big battle with the warriors, the smallpox, and finally Rinderpest, the cattle epidemic, and smallpox again, which killed off many people. Our heroes ended up in the forest, living as Dorobo, as hunter-gatherers. And people to this day still speak about that period and what their grandparents experienced with great sadness and bitterness. So for 2 years, they were out of it. I say this as parallels to today because again, there's fighting and again, there's long drought and there's uncertainty, and not only in East Africa, it's our own country as well. So I think this is a fitting story for that. Second part of your question, Carrie, remind me.
What did you bring to it as an ethnographer? Like what, as opposed to being a fiction writer? To me, it really reads as like densely saturated with an ethnographic sensibility, right?
Right.
What do you think you brought to the art of fiction writing as an ethnographer?
It's still hard for me to think that I'm a fiction writer, but I'm learning to accept that title. So in the middle of the book, there's a very long 8-set ritual that I would know nothing about unless I witnessed it myself. So the ethnography of Samburu and Maasai people, where all the men go through these rituals, women do too, of their own, and it's a very important part of their society. So I take some time going into that, the nervousness, what people felt. For young men, really 13-year-old boys, their initiation into the 8-set is to be circumcised in public, and they're not allowed to wince, let alone scream out. It's a real rite of passage. Women too have their rite of passage because on their wedding day, they undergo the female circumcision, more properly, clitoridectomy, and their lives change. So I just say the anthropology, the ethnography, knowing these people constantly informed me what I was writing about. Thank you.
Wonderful. Barbara Garcia is in California right now, and she has written and asked, and she says, I love the story. I'm curious about the clan's concept of God in the 19th century. Can you talk a little about how that evolved among people? Had Christianity reached East Asia at that time?
Well, first of all, hello, Barbara, my favorite student from Smith College of all time. But she's been out in a while working and doing her thing. Not just to Barbara, so two questions. People were very, very spiritual among Maasai, and probably most peoples I know in the world have a strong spiritual yearnings and have ideas and stories about God and how it came. The Maasai are no different than anyone else. Their stories are different. The word for God, Engai, is actually a feminine word. It's not a male word. And their conception is God's the creator. It's not a human. It doesn't intervene on earth very much, but it's someone we pray to every day for peace and for rain. They also have mystical views about witches and ghosts. That's why I used witchcraft in the title, that enemies were out to get you. And they were human enemies, but they could use magic medicines to hurt you. And that was also a concern among Native Americans, among African groups. Christianity, as far as this group is concerned, did not really arrive until 1900, when the British carried out their colonization. There were missionaries before. Most people hadn't seen them. There were Muslim traders from the coast. Their only interaction usually was to trade or to slave. So they didn't capture those religious ideas very much either. But once the colonial religion set in, you had schools, you had churches, you had clinics that were run by missionaries and still do to this day. And that's a very powerful kind of message. These people are powerful. Their God must be powerful, and I'll believe. And they're sincere believers. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Thanks, Elliot. Someone asks, what are the differences between the tribe you describe in your novel compared to the one you studied in modern times?
Good. So the Samburu are a Maasai speaking group who live in northern Kenya. And, I joined them almost by accident. I was trying to go to Ethiopia in 1974 to study people along the Omo River on the Ethiopian border, where a lot of conflict is happening. But I couldn't get in there. That month, there was a coup d'etat against Haile Selassie, their emperor, and I was turned back at the border. And there I was stuck in a little town in northern Kenya. And a young boy, maybe 14, said, do you want to see elephants? No, I've seen elephants. Do you want to see native dancing? I said, yeah, I want to see native dancing. So we went back to his village on my motorcycle. And it wasn't just native dancing. I could tell right away this was a large ritual. All the warriors were dancing in a circle, getting blessed, wiped on the head with a white powder from a small man in a green cloth who was the Libon. And I met those people. I was invited to stay. I did. And I have to say, I'm still in touch with people through Facebook and every other medium. But the lives of these people are very important to me. So I live with them off and on. My wife lived with them off and on for many decades. Samburu are not Maasai, as I'm sure people who know the Maasai will say, that's right, they're not. But they're so close and they come from the same people. And I see John Galati's out there in the audience. He could really help explain the early history of these groups coming into Kenya, down from Sudan, speaking the same language, but then dividing off, some moving to the south, some staying in the north, the Laikipia in the center, until that ended by 1900. Then the British colonists came in and they took the middle for themselves. I can go to Maasai land and speak my Samburu dialect, and people there really laugh. I said, where is this guy from? Do you hear the way he's talking like a Samburu? But it was close enough. They had age sets. Their marriage ceremonies were the same. Their belief system was almost the same. Their folk stories were the same. So I call the Samburu and the Ariel, who are a mixed group that I live with. They were Ma speakers, they were Maasai for all practical purposes, but they're not exactly the same.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Someone writes, this novel seems important in that it allows the reader to extend their empathy and imagine themselves in the place of the characters. However, many criticize authors who write about cultures other than their own. How would you respond to criticism that this book could exoticize another and project your own emotional perspective upon the people?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you for that question. If I could inspire empathy for this group of people I'm writing about from you, the audience, who don't come from that group, then I really feel like I achieved a purpose. I have to tell you, some of the greatest comments on this book have come from Maasai, and in fact, Laikipia Maasai, there's still some left who are on the county council, who are businessmen, who are fans. And they write to me, hope some are on the Zoom today. And they like the book. People are very proud of their culture. They want it inscribed in books. They wanted other people to know who they are and their histories. So I never felt awkward in that sense. I am aware as a white male American anthropologist that there are tremendous differences between me and Africans in their own home. I don't want to sound condescending. I don't feel I was condescending, but it's something I have to pay attention to. this word about privilege and my living conditions. Absolutely, we're privileged. And everybody in the village knew it and liked it because my privilege could benefit them. I remember at night, tired, I turned on my little gas stove to heat up some water for tea after I thought everybody was gone, and I would eat some cookies. And then 2 or 3 heads would appear in my door. And they were elders who always knew when I was cooking tea. And they would say things like, only the hyena eats alone. I said, yes, I know that problem. Well, come on in, I made enough tea for everybody. So there was this mutual sharing. And many anthropologists will describe similar values of reciprocity. I gave what I could, they gave what they could. And it worked for 2 years for me. And I don't feel I was exploiting them. On the other hand, at the end of the day, my career was based on those people, writing about those people. So I have obligations to people in the family that I live with. I continue to support. They have like 8 kids. Unfortunately, the live one died, and then his son, who I became very good friends with, also died. And I wanted to tell their story, and I think I have. So thank you for that question.
What informed you about the lives of this tribe in the 19th century? How much came from your imagination and how much from original sources? And what kinds of original sources exist out there about this?
Yeah, good. So there are original sources that are written. The Maasai don't have them, but other people did. In 1882, a Scottish explorer named Joseph Thompson, explored from Mombasa on the coast to Lake Victoria, going right through the Maasai land. And he describes the Maasai, who he admired. Not everybody else did, but he admired. He thought they were handsome, and he liked their cattle, and he joined them for some time. And he wrote down the stories from them of the Laikipia battle that I describe in the book. He wrote down the stories of behavior of some Libons that I also write about in that book. There's other accounts. Anthropologists who work with Maasai, there are several very detailed, I would call them ethnographies, books about different people, many of them written by missionaries in East Africa, German and British. And those books survive. And so they help inform. These pictures that you can see in the back, I don't know if I could share it again. Maybe I can't share it. Yeah, this one. This was, these photos were taken in the 1930s.
See it, Elliot.
Sorry, can you see it?
No, if you hit share screen at the bottom, you should be able to get it.
Okay, I don't see a share screen. Okay, nope. I'm an idiot when it comes to Zoom and everything else. So I'll just leave that for now. There is reconstruction, and that picture itself, like on the cover of the book, may be a reconstruction that colonial people and photographers took to kind of envision what those lost times look like. On the other hand, many people are still living their existence of cattle herding in Ethiopia and Kenya and Tanzania that they have for several hundred years. So it's not hard to imagine what their lives were like. There is fiction. I make up conversations, but I don't make up places, and I don't make up events. Those were real. So you have to be careful. Historical fiction is a lot of fun to read and to write, but it's fraught with its problems. These anachronisms. Am I saying something that just isn't real? But I'll live with that, and I think I did okay with this. Next question.
So in a related way, one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading was, this is obviously a work of historical fiction, but you've sort of maybe gestured to it a little. What are the lessons there are for the present day that are embedded within the book? What can we learn from the way that these folks navigate crisis, for instance?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. It was in my mind a lot, not just writing the novel, but doing my research. These people live with adversity. These people are constantly having to deal with sudden changes in the weather, sudden changes in politics, sudden changes within the fabric of their own family lives. And so do we. We have climate change, we have wars that don't ever seem to end. But we also have joy, and we share, and we have marriage, and we raise children. So it's not that dissimilar. That's something I try to teach my students. Maasai are among the most exoticized population in Africa. Their long red hair and the beautiful cloth and the jewelry the men and women wear. And so it's almost a stereotype for so-called tribal Africa. And unfortunately, Kenya also uses this to their advantage to promote tourism, to get people to come back to a place and a time that barely exists. There may not be much more than 500,000 Maasai, maybe 700,000. They're not a very large group in a country of 30 million. And I must say, as someone who studies indigenous people's rights, they're not always on the positive side of getting treated well. The government is made up of farmers, and they don't like pastoral people. And that happens all over Africa. So, I'm sorry, Caroline, remind me again.
No, just what are the lessons embedded within this story for contemporary, COVID climate change world?
Yeah, resilience. I mean, that's what they showed me. They didn't disappear. Everybody said, oh, the Laikipek were finished in 1870. Well, no, they weren't. Guy I was living with, his grandfather was Laikipek, and he could remember a lot of that society that he shared with me, and that other Laikipek descendants can also share. But the idea that, in any society, you have good people and you have bad people, you have people who want to plunder, and you have people who want to share. Really, it's not just a phrase. I don't think that 19th century Maasai or any other group have this primitive knowledge or tribal knowledge that we should learn from. Everything is so good. No, they were facing the same kind of crisis as we are. Well, how are we going to eat? How are we going to live with these neighbors who are being mean to us? How are we going to get our kids educated? And they do say that. So I guess as a purpose of the book and a purpose of my teaching is to try to communicate that to students. Despite the glamour and the exoticism, again, at the end, they're real people with real issues to do. And I think that's true for everybody. And in a multi-ethnic world that we live in, I hope now that we're done with the last administration, we can take some time to appreciate that and appreciate the differences in each other. Thank you.
One audience member actually is sort of picking up on this thread and asks a great question, which is, what do you hear from the folks that you used to work with in terms of current issues? Are they being impacted by COVID and other world problems?
Yeah, no, that's really true. I don't know the direct answer to that, not from the people I know. I haven't heard that, but I have heard and I've read accounts that COVID is very widespread and is spreading rapidly. There was a delay, and their medical help is not very sophisticated in terms of number of clinics and access to doctors. So especially in the rural areas, I think city people have it better. But it was similar during the HIV crisis in the 80s. You hear many people, especially people I live in, say, that'll never happen to me. That comes about by people wanting to harm you. I don't sleep with women who aren't my wife, etc. But that AIDS swept through every place, including Samburu on Maasai, and people are still living with that. I think COVIDs will also sweep through. Great hope with the vaccine. I really urge everybody in India, in Russia, in Canada, in America, wherever you're making vaccines, make sure to get them to the people in the developing world. Surely they need them as much as we do.
Harriet Brickman asks, do you intend to write another novel? How would you set it?
Wow. I guess I've asked myself that question. Probably will. You get the bug and you just keep writing. Marty and I have a summer home on a little island in the Bay of Fundy. I think 140 people live there. I'm thinking of doing a murder, she wrote kind of story based in the islands where every week somebody gets murdered and we try to find out who it is. I'm kind of joking, but I mean, there's lots of ways to go. I love mysteries. I think I've probably finished it on this subject of East Africa. Maybe not, but writing is a wonderful thing, and it's a real gift, and I'm glad that it's coming to me late in life. Thank you.
It's kind of exciting, honestly, Elliot, to see the ways in which your, writing career really evolved over time, right? From like policy reports and sort of, ethnographic monographs into memoir style and into fiction, and now even into fiction that is heading in entirely new directions. It's kind of exciting to see the way it keeps opening up new possibilities.
It does, and it does for me. I remember in the 1970s, I gave a professional paper in Philadelphia where my parents lived. And I invited my mother, and she came with my Uncle Sam, and they sat on the front row like this, And what it was, the title was, gosh, I can't even remember, but measuring labor inputs from different grades and generations in Samburu village. And it was basically showing numbers on the screen. And after it was over, my mother, whose eyes had glazed over, said, I didn't understand a word of that. Why don't you tell them your loogie stories? Loogie was my best friend in the village, and I would tell her stories about him because he was really a wonderful guy and very humorous. And I said, she's right. How many people benefit from the numbers? Some do. I still argue that. It's still a purpose of mine to tell government people that pastoral people are not wastrels. Pastoral people are not ignorant. You have to put development money there. Don't try to make them into ranchers. Don't try to make them into capitalists, because it's something that doesn't go very well. Although with some people it does, but for many people who are traditional herders, and they rely on their fellow herders to survive, you should appreciate that. And I think other people who study pastoral nomads say the same thing. Yep.
I love it. Thank you. Norma Akamutsu writes, how did the spirituality of the Maasai affect you personally?
Okay, thank you, Norma.
That's a great question, Norma.
Wonderful questions. Doing field work, people would ask me, do you believe in God? It was a very important question. It was a very important question when Marty and I were doing Fulbrights in Ethiopia, among the most spiritual people I know. And, in truth, I'm not a spiritual person. I never have been. My wife's not a spiritual person, never has been. But we have a lot of respect for religion, of course. We don't try to put it down or say you shouldn't do this. But personally, it's not something that rides high. Again, what rides high is humanity, not spirituality. Humanity and how we can help each other rather than hurt each other. And that's what I gained from the field work. And Norma, I think you can understand that because that could be the spiritualism or religion you're thinking about, which is compassionate, especially this Easter holiday.
Thank you. One attendee writes, I wonder if Maasai readers hold the same meaning of fiction as you do. Is there a Ma word for fiction? And is that concept something, I guess, relevant in some kind of way?
Well, mind you, the majority now of Kenyans, Maasai, have been educated. They're urban. They live in cities or smaller towns. They do read. You see people reading everywhere on the buses and everywhere else. And people like fiction, people like historical facts. And so, they want more of my book, get it into the bookshops. And I say, well, tell my publisher. So I think they would like it, and they do read. So again, don't want to typologize or make people seem something different than what they really are. So could you repeat part of that question? I didn't catch.
Is there an indigenous notion of fiction, or is there like an existing concept or framework or word for that?
Yeah, we call it storytelling, and storytelling is it's universal. I'm sure the earliest humans, as soon as they could speak, started telling stories about their day or about their girlfriends they wish they had, or about monsters or about things they hunted. And so storytelling is very important. And, when I lived there in the 70s, there was no electricity. There was no lights after sunset, which was 6 p.m. So you had to find things to do. Fortunately, we have a moon that comes up every month. And the first half of the month, it gets brighter and brighter and brighter until the full moon. Everybody's sitting outside. They're either singing or they're telling stories Mothers put their children to bed. They tell them stories. I wrote down as many of these as I could, which are dozens, and I'm sure there's hundreds in Maasai folklore. And they're really things that hold cultures together. And I think storytelling is probably, I hate to say this, but a basic component of being a human. This is what humans do. They like listening to stories, like telling stories. They would ask me to tell folk stories from my country. And I said, well, I don't know. They're impeaching Nixon right now. This is probably a good drama. And I did tell them that. And they loved it. Give me a good story.
Definitely part of that human resilience you were talking about earlier, right? Definitely baked into that for sure.
Yeah. Now, sometimes it's hard to translate. So in 1974, when Nixon is ready to be impeached, but he resigns, I go out, for some coffee and chapatis with friends. Some are school teachers, some are lawyers, all from the same community. And I said, so what is Watergate? I don't even know what it is. And I said, I'll tell you what it is. Watergate is a hotel, a hotelly. And they go, hotelly? I said, yeah, it's a big building. And one of the political parties had their offices there. And the other political parties came in the middle of the night, like thieves, like Caperon, to steal their information. And they got caught. Then it was easy to start to explain. He covered it up. He didn't want people to know it. And then the remark, I guess I should feel sad about it. One of the guys said, what's wrong with that? In our country, we love strong leaders. If you don't have a strong leader, how can your country survive? I said, okay, well, I guess you'll be a Republican too, and leave it at that.
So Frederick Sherman asks, can you see yourself going from historical fiction writer to screenwriter? As some of the themes you discussed are actually in the movie, The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind.
Yes. Boy, it's my dream. That's my joke. I'm waiting for Netflix to write me. We had Black Panther. Now we can have another, Black production. I wanted it to be filmed in Kenya with Kenyan crew and Kenyan writers. I don't know how to communicate that is the problem, but I would love to. I think this would make a great film.
How would you do it differently? Or what would you imagine for it?
What would I, in terms of
in the film
screenplay?
Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't got that far, but I was thinking of starting a screenplay. I mean, somebody advised me to do that because it's dramatic. It has lots of twists and turns. When you read the whole book, people getting killed, babies getting killed, people falling in love, all kinds of things that I think would make a good film. And in fact, my friend, Jürgen Schwartz, who was a biologist when I was out there in Kenya, it's in Germany now, he was saying this is very visual. I can see this. It should come into a film. I don't know if I can do that yet, but there's something to think about. I still got some years left on my retirement, I hope.
You've reinvented yourself before, right? So
yes, getting a high school degree was a reinvention. Getting a college degree was a reinvention. Getting a PhD was a reinvention, yes. And joining Smith faculty with colleagues like you, that was a great reinvention and pleasure for me.
Likewise. David Galati writes, and I hope that I pronounce these properly. Do we know how this Olo Iboni is related to Mbianti and his family?
Is related to whom? Which one? How this Loibon is related?
Mbatian.
Mbatian. Now, Mbatian is, he's almost a legendary figure, but he was a real person alive in the 1880s, whose predictions were said to give the Southern Maasai, the Porco and the Loita and people who joined him vision, and his medicines were better than the Laibon of the Laikipiaq. And I think David knows this story pretty well. The Laibon of the Laikipiaq, Koti, said, my medicines will defeat that one-eyed bastard Mbatian, and we'll win this battle. But in the end, it didn't. And Mbatian was able to rally another tribe, Kisongo, from Tanzania to join him. And they did literally defeat the Laikipiaq. The Laikipiaq are gone. On the other hand, and there's a section in my book about this, all Laibons, especially Maasai Laibons, are said to be related. And they're all said to descend from the same people that Mbatian descended from. And they say that. I won't do DNA to make sure this is true, but it's an important tradition that we all come from the same stock, and that's how we have our powers. And live-born daughters also have powers of prediction, even though they don't publicly practice. And one of my live-born daughters marries my hero Katoip in the second part of the book. So I think you would enjoy reading about that. And David, it's very nice to hear from you. And Achoeling, which means thank you.
Barbara asks another question. Is there a universal origin story among the Maasai, and what is it?
Yes, there is. I mean, I read it written down in folklores, you know, starting in 1902, Hollis writes down folk stories. People say our origins are in the Curio Valley. The Curio is a river from the bottom of Lake Turkana that opens up into the whole Rift Valley. We came from up there, and God gave us a rope to climb out of the valley to where we are now, and God gave us cattle. So every cow out there is descended from our cattle, and so we have rights to take it back. The Curio is actually probably true. They probably did come from South Sudan with other cattle people. There's new histories being done. I'm sure John Galati has been on top of this, and other people in the audience. Some people are saying their migration into Kenya might be very recent, might be 200 years old, not 500 years old. And that's the way history is. It can move very fast. And so there is origin stories. More often there's folk stories that are, to me, fun and funny and have lessons in them. And if you read the Libon book, there's a couple of those folk stories in there. And I think there's many books on Maasai folk stories that Naomi Kapori and other people have put together, oral histories.
So we're running up at the end of time, more or less here. I want to first thank everyone for coming. We're thrilled to host our dear colleague, Elliot, and to see all of you here too. I want to give you, Elliot, the last word. And I was just wondering if there's any question you wish would have been asked that you'd like to answer. Is there anything sort of in our final moments together you'd like to share with us before we all head off and buy our copies if we haven't already?
Yeah, please buy your copies. You have to buy it on Amazon because unfortunately the publisher doesn't sell through local bookstore consortiums. And I don't like to push Amazon or the publisher directly, which is Africa World Press.
Right.
It's $21 a copy. So I think most people can well afford it. So please do read it. You know, I'm just delighted that I was able to share this story. You know, at first, when I wrote this book, I said, nobody's going to be interested in this. I'll have 4 readers and they'll all be blood relatives or married relatives. And to find other people reading it and writing to me and talking about it is very gratifying. I really like that. There's many things in the book I did not go into, and I wish I could have. How when they're starving in the 1890s, how Katoip and his wife and family move into the forest and live with pygmies. And pygmies are hunter-gatherers. And his first experience hunting elephants, something they would never do in natural life, but they do. And it was very shameful when the person told me that story, that we had to eat elephants. There's wonderful things like that, and including the rituals, the wedding ceremonies, and so on. But it's in there. I can't add now, tack it on, but I'd be happy to, you know, anybody who wants to write me directly, efratkin@smith.edu. Please write. I'll answer whatever questions you wish, because the chat group here, I don't think will last long. I think we're also arranging, we recorded this to show it again for people who have missed it. So if you have friends who say, I want to see this, then we'll make that possible. So thank you. Thank you for coming and listening. I'm really happy.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for attending. Please reach out to Professor Elliot Fratkin if you do have any questions. On behalf of the Department of Anthropology and the rest of Smith, we miss you, Elliot. It was great to see you today.
Me
Thanks,
too.
everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.